Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Paul Spencer of Zeitville Media. Very, very interesting figure, very influential for my own thoughts, particularly related to the Patchwork Age, and also like just tons of stuff. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, man. Thank you for having me.
Can you give our listeners an understanding of your take on the Patchwork Age?
Yeah. The Patchwork Age is an idea that I formulated in 2020. It actually was spurred from a tweet. I had seen some people picnicking in a field in March or April of that year, uh, right after the lockdowns had occurred. And it just was a striking image to me that pinged off of some ideas that I had been formulating for years up to that point. And it was like they had reorganized an old territory. And from there, I just started observing the breakdown of these large cultural institutions that held everything together in a synchronistic way for us to have a kind of a shared sense of meaning. And I call that the big tent. So it's like this overarching fabric that we kind of look up to, like the night sky, and synchronize our collective meaning from. So when that shattered or got torn apart, it's this idea now that we have to stitch together the various pieces of our culture in order to derive meanings for ourselves on an individual or micro tribal level, in order to feel that there's any type of sense in the world now.
And so obviously it feels like technology plays a really big role in that and it feels like the big tent, I think you often refer to the 90s as the time of the big tent. And it feels like, particularly with
Yes.
the millennials, it's like, we grew up in the 90s and in the United States, and the image of Hillary Clinton dancing to the Macarena in like 94 or something like that keeps on coming up.
Absolutely.
But it's
Yeah.
like a golden age. And now, in the golden age I had the expectation, I imagine many of my compatriots had the expectation that it would just continue. And It did
Yes.
not continue, and it's all breaking down. And I've come to terms with that. It was quite difficult to come to terms with that, or I hope I've come to terms with that. It feels like there could be a golden age still kind of hidden out there, but not in the same form. Definitely not in the same form. Like it feels like that collapsed. What's your take on that?
Yeah. I think that the 90s, I've been seeing a lot of takes on the 90s on X, and there's a bit of a retrospective glow that's being cast upon them. But it is true that they kind of occupied this weird bridge of analog and digital zeitgeist. And I think that really that's what, in a way, that we're not coming back to, because I say that in my newsletters and tweets a lot, that we're not returning to something. I think that that's kind of like a false utopia that people project, but instead that we are kind of, there were some facets of the 90s that I think will be very present in the 2020s, and that there's a hybridized aspect to the way that people interact and create things. And a lot of that's going to be mixing various genres, various ideas that are typically cordoned off because there's a strong puritanical thread in our current culture. And through creating these bridges, restore a sense of that 90s exuberance.
That's really interesting. The puritanical thing, that's something I only heard you mention in the recent essay that you wrote, called, I believe it was, you're in an episode. And
Yes.
and so the Puritan streak is really interesting because I've actually been trying to dip into my past, my ancestors, and figure out whether they were Puritans, or figure out whether there are other types of people who had moved to the United States. Turns out we were Episcopalian, or at least part of us were Episcopalian. I'm sure there's some Puritans in there as well. And it relates a lot to my discoveries of the 1960s and my investigations in the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s, in particular, the fall of Western religion and Western civilization, or the legitimacy of Western spiritual traditions, and the rise of the Eastern ones.
Sure.
But instead of just like instead of it being an Eastern religion, it's an Eastern religion that's been synergized with the Western religions, and particularly in my recent discoveries, more puritanical type of thing. So a lot of what people call Western
Right.
Buddhism is actually Puritanism, this sort of asceticism that comes from trying to
Absolutely.
become pure, which is what got me kicked out of a meme group for posting memes in relation to that. But what's your take on that?
So Thomas Merton was a very strong and influential figure during the 60s in creating a kind of interfaith discourse around Buddhism in the West. It wasn't just him, there were a lot of other figures, but he was very influential. He was a monk who lived in a monastery in Kentucky,
Wow.
which is still there, practicing more or less traditional Catholicism. Very prolific writer, very outspoken advocate for ending the Vietnam War. Had a rather strange circumstances around his death. Some people would even say that he was assassinated. So what's happened with him is that some of his writings, he became very interested in Buddhism. And he was finding, again, as we're talking about, I actually have referred to Thomas Merton in some past threads on the Patchwork Age as, one of the ideas of the Patchwork Age is we have these various cultural touchstones in the past that we can use. We're not just left to our own devices, that we can use to create have a creative sense of what's possible. And he was one of those figures that was showing what was possible in the 60s by showing that there are bridges of thought between Buddhism and Catholicism. His first book was Seven Story Mountain, which was, again, a very kind of, he regretted that book. He rewrote it when he was very young because he had this kind of bombastic know-it-all energy that is very common now on Twitter and social media. I think, though, he wasn't very it's very interesting now that we're kind of tunneling into this figure because he wasn't very pure. At least that wasn't his message when creating this bridge between Buddhism and bringing it into the Western Christian thought and Catholicism. Because what happened is as a monk, you take a vow of celibacy, and he's become kind of a somewhat controversial figure in the Catholic community because towards the end of his life, he didn't die old. I'll tell you about his death here in a second. He struck up a relationship with a young nurse and wrote about it quite a bit and struggled with that in terms of his Catholic guilt. And so that's all publicly known. And shortly after he developed this relationship, I think she was a nurse, it was something like that. But after he developed this relationship, he went, as he often did, to travel and give a talk. There's actually a YouTube clip of him, hours or minutes before he died, where he closes the talk. Okay. And it's really great because this is a very Thomas Merton-esque uh, moment. One of the things that he was known for was bringing a lot of his urban culture into the Catholic community. So he was often seen wearing a denim jacket along with the
stuff.
the monk frock, right, or a baseball cap or something like that. But he closes out the talk, says, "All right, let's go. That's it for right now, everyone. Let's take a break and go have a Coca-Cola." This Coca-Cola being in the '60s, the most kind of capitalistic thing you can imagine. And he's in these Eastern countries and going on with the Vietnam War, and you have French filmmakers like Godard making films named "The Children of Marx and Coca-Cola." He's basically talking about this dichotomy between communist countries, Eastern religions, and the Western kind of pop culture commercialism. Well, anyways, he goes and takes a bath, and some appliance falls in the tub, and he's electrocuted, and he dies. And that's the speculation too, is that he was becoming a controversial figure. He was stepping outside the bounds of Catholic behavior. He was also strong anti-war advocate and going on these talks and creating a real collective movement by bridging these types of thought. But you really don't see that now. And I've been really adamant about saying that any kind of collective movement is going to be quite small. And part of the smallness of that, as opposed to Merton's kind of big tent vision, is that it's puritanical, because people are creating in miniature the big tent that once existed. And in order to do that, because we live now in a post-big tent world that's full of contradictions and oppositional thought and weird combinations, the only way that they can do that is to create a kind of cult or commune, or a very strong demarcation around themselves, and to create a purity spiral, because otherwise, very quickly, the behavior of the members, just by the fact that they live in today's environment, will have contradictory aspects to them that negate the mission statement of said group. And so, yeah, there is a strong push for puritanical thought, and even what even trad communities might call degenerate communities. Even these communities are puritanical. You see this a lot in the dating discourse and in the gender discourse about how to find people to date and what to do about it and all that. They're very strict as well, in a kind of Zen trad cath way, and it's people's deep need to have certainty, because that's really absent right now, and so they try to create it through puritanical bubbles, or the phrase that you use that I really like lately is reality tunnel.
And this is so interesting for me because now I'm in Argentina, and in many ways Argentina is a parallel universe to the United States. Very similar constitution, very similar histories, but with little things that change. And both in the 1910s and 1920s, both Argentina and the United States were on a same trajectory. The United States fulfilled its potential. Argentina did not. And Argentina got stuck in these loops after loops after loops after loops. But some of the changes, and I meant loops of chaos and not fulfilling its potential. And I often feel, both with Brazil and Argentina, I feel a sort of like connection with both of these places, because I have often failed to live up to my potential, at least the potential that I thought was the most important when I was younger. Now the potential is coming out, but it's in a very, very different way than what I was kind of given the impression of when I was younger. And so Argentina feels like it's in the 90s still. There's a couple
different about Mexico City too.
Well, so all of Latin America to an extent, and including Brazil, feels like it's in the 90s. And part of it is the social fabric, which I think both of us agree is sort of dissolved, if not already
Yes,
dissolving in the United States,
correct.
still exists here. Social media did not cause the same sort of problems that it did here as it did in the United States. So, and that's part of why it feels so nice to be here, is because it feels like I'm back in the 90s. And Argentina also has a younger population. So they have the same demographic crisis as have in the United States, as
Interesting.
Europe has, but it's 20 years late. So there is a young population, and the new president who was just elected, most of his support comes from that young population.
Hmm.
And so there's a vitality and an energy here that exists that does not exist in the United States and Europe. And so there's a lot of things that are going on here, but the one key part I don't think I got to yet, which is that well, no, it's the social fabric thing. I feel like there's the codes still exist here. If you want to be Argentine, all the codes are very clear. It's not
Huh.
that same confusion that I feel being in the
Yeah.
United States.
Well,
Um,
that's it right there. I mean, the fact that you can have basically an on-demand identity delivered to you through a coordinated, agreed upon set of codes
yeah.
that is basically a consensus reality. Not having that is what creates all these infighting, creates all this infighting within the micro tribes. So one of the things I talk about in the Patchwork Manifesto is fractionation,
Uh,
and that micro tribes will fractionate down to micro tribes, even down to more micro levels, until you're left with one person. And even that person, because of the contradictory ideas that they embody, just by the fact that they're swimming in the water that is culture, like it's just you tweet about, off the grid homesteading on your iPhone that was made in China, right?
yeah.
You are fractionating down within yourself to the point that it's infinite at that point.
Yeah.
And it's not this. There are some octaves where this can be seen as atomization, but really it comes back to the idea of the patchwork is that these aren't separate nodes
Yeah. Interesting.
suspended in water or suspended in ether. The fractionation is happening to multiply the amount of combinations that are possible.
Hmm.
So you fractionate, we're following this process, we're saying you fractionate down into yourself infinitely, new combinations of personality to thrive, creative, in order to launch new ideas and products and artistic process. You have this big blocky stagnation of trying to claw back the big tent,
Yeah.
and really only appeals to people who are self-selected for that. So I don't know, trying to be kind of a red pill guru in 2024, only the true believers actually are on that wavelength and that frequency and resonate with that message, because to wide swaths of people, you're basically, your reference point is imaginary. It's a holographic
Hmm.
fiction that doesn't exist. You simply cannot go into a public place and apply these kinds of gender discourse concepts as if it's 2005 still,
Hmm.
because behaviorally, and we can go into the woo-woo here,
Hmm.
electromagnetically or on a
Hmm.
consciousness wavelength, people are not the same
Hmm.
anymore. You cannot just try to program them to act the same. It has been a sea change, and so uh, that's why there's also a lot of frustration that I talked about in the recent newsletter, a lot of resentment, a lot of revenge fantasy.
And there's no one to
Because
scapegoat. There's no one to scapegoat, right?
there's no one to scapegoat. You
Yeah.
can't blame someone for not responding to a stimulus that worked 20 years ago because their consciousness has changed. That's just, I don't even know what to call that. It's
Yeah.
it's something beyond stubborn. I refer to it as cultish. It's this insistence that reality must look and operate in a way that it once did.
And that's the whole point of modernity too, because it's like modernity,
Yep.
like even the etymology of modernity comes from Latin, which means mode, which means now. So it means that whoever came up with the term modernity in the group, it basically was saying, well, this is it now. Whatever comes after this, it's all part of this now. And then the postmodern and
That's
all this
Ezra
other
Pound,
thing.
poet Ezra Pound, T.S.
That's
Eliot.
Oh,
Modernity
interesting.
is, yeah, their thesis is modernity equals, their definition of modernity is true is new, or new is true, rather.
Oh,
So it's exactly what you're saying.
interesting. So it's the neophilia, and this will kind of go back to the history, because it feels like what we're going through is like the Dark Ages, except with the Dark Ages we had this sort of like biggest of biggest tense, where it was just the religion, it was just Catholicism, and mind was on
Right.
infinity, and our secular time that didn't even exist. Like it wasn't even a now. It was just like, oh, we're in the infinite now. Like we have no sense of history. The Romans were there a long time ago, and
Right.
we're somehow descended from the Romans, but God's now, and now the only thing is be poor and devote your life to God. Nothing else really matters. And there's like this lost of history and progress and stuff. And now it feels like that thing is happening, except with the biggest of the big tent. It's going to be like you're saying, fracturing until it's all just like a cult of one. And
Yep.
then and it's just so hard to peer into that future and understand where it's headed, because it feels so
Yeah.
foreign, bizarre.
So I actually wrote my master's thesis on this discussion of the crystallization of time as the project of modernity, as coming out of the Enlightenment and really crystallizing during the industrial age. A lot of times I refer to the Big Ten as the public square. We literally would have a clock tower in the public square in the town center, so that there was this synchronization of meaning. We didn't even have, and it's funny, because you and I were talking earlier about matching up time zones. You're in South America, I'm on East Coast, US. Time zones across the US were instituted as part of the transcontinental railroad development during the industrial age. So there was this insistence again on creating a synchronistic consensus reality. And one of the things that I went into in the Patchwork Manifesto is that that process, the trajectory of it, the reason that it shattered is because it reached a fever pitch. We didn't moderate that process. It's just one step from that to Marshall McLuhan's Global Village, where he talks about how electronic media and communication makes everybody else's backyard business yours. And it's funny because now we're going hyper local with that shattering. And I talk about, the Seinfeld phenomenon, or even just the kind of blockbuster phenomenon in the 90s. And it gets really destabilized as we get into, as I wrote in a recent newsletter, the Kardashian epidemic of the 2010s. And now you'll get these, and this is another thing I often write about too, you'll get these big current things like, Ukrainian flag memes, and Taylor Swift and Kelsey, or Oppenheimer and Barbie, and they hold our attention briefly, but
then they're gone.
They're gone because the global village is actually, it still exists, but we're also returning to a hyper local sense where people are just like, I don't care. Like, I'm trying to keep my family, my micro tribe, my job, my daily routine of habits intact. And I can barely do that because part of the thing with the patchwork age is you don't just stitch something together, your reality together, and then it's done. You're remixing constantly. Yeah, you're unstitching things. And so, there was this whole, it's so funny to see these, I've got a couple of good commenters on X. It's so funny to see these attempts to kind of create this stability in the patchwork age, like, oh, everybody went outside for the solar eclipse in April, or everybody left the cities and then they moved to the suburbs because they're all work from home. And then like all of this contradictory information comes in, like, okay, everybody's going back to the office. Okay, everybody realized like being a homesteader isn't for them. Now they're going back to the cities. Now people are going back to the office. Yeah, everybody was into a solar eclipse, but now all these like nutcases think that, you know, it was like a staged event. You know, that was one of the things on social media. So you try to have some sense of like, okay, it's been remixed, but it's stable again. It's like a post Big Tent, right? And it just doesn't, it can't hang around that long. So it's really fascinating watching the collective try to cope with the fact that stability comes through instability now, through constant remixing. And that's where the pleasure, that's one of the things I talk about too, that there's pleasure in not just creativity. Because I think a lot of people deal with the fact that they're burnout, they're low energy, they're frustrated, they're angry, they feel duped by institutions. And you know, this remixing, it can be a source of vitality, but you have to let go of a lot of old ways of experiencing reality. So I talk a lot about cultivating a capacity for creativity and cultivating a capacity for new forms of pleasure, because otherwise you're going to say it doesn't hit the same, but I'll go back to it anyway, like an old vape pen. Like I'll go back to just kind of binge watching this old show. And that's not to say that you can't do that. Like most of the films that I review and TV shows that I review in my newsletter are binge watching old films and TV shows because
it's a content apocalypse. There's nothing good out.
There's nothing else to look at currently until we kind of recover the gems from the past and then actually start creating something that is vital and meaningful to us. Otherwise, everybody thinks, okay, I'm going to create the next Star Wars, and really what it is it's pissing off both camps. The right dislike being hit over the head with woke messages, and the woke get, you know, whatever they want, but because, you know, the other half of the populace or whatever, it's not even half, even all those sects are fractionated, they don't get the same thing that you see on those Twitter threads, which is people with a camcorder outside of a movie theater in the 90s, and whether this person is leftist or rightist or, you know, whatever race or class, all these kind of leftist rubrics, they're all extremely excited about the happening, the event. And so the left doesn't get it what it wants, and the right doesn't get what it wants either. And so what happens is that these camps take to social media and they're both dissatisfied. They're not finding pleasure. They're not finding creativity.
Nobody's satisfied. And I mean, even in the 90s, nobody was satisfied because all that satisfaction, the velocity of the satisfaction was much longer, or sorry, the staying power of the satisfaction of Seinfeld was much longer than it is now. And this brings us directly to what just happened this last week was so interesting. And we don't have to get like political in the sense of like partisan politics or anything like that. But like the debate, that was such an interesting experience. It was so sad. It was so like it felt very just like that's, I guess that's the new low. And
it's not anticlimactic even. It's that's the thing that we're kind of talking about here, is that each attempt to create a happening or an event just falls short. And it's almost like I watched the debate, I watched the memes after it, but it's almost like you can't even mind this kind of thing. This is almost a very Baudrillard. If you're familiar with Baudrillard, his book was featured in the first Matrix movie because he wrote about this concept of a simulacra, which is a copy of reality. It's similar to what I think is his name is, it's not Clausewitz. I'm forgetting the guy's name, but I often refer to it It's his law.
Chesterton.
Is it? No, it's not Chesterton.
Huh.
It's not Clausewitz either.
Huh.
Let me search my Twitter for it, because I learned this concept from Marshall McLuhan. He would feature it quite often in his books, and I liked it better than Baudrillard's concept of the simulacra. Hertz's law. Yeah. Yep. And so the idea, the phrase of Hertz's law is the consequences of the images will be the images of the consequences, meaning that consequences become not physical, visceral, tangible, but they become a thought that you project into the memeplex, into the meme coliseum, and you identify with it, and you're like, oh, I hope my idea wins out. You don't have any ability to sway it. You're just kind of crossing your fingers that yours will be the most viral and rise to the top. And so what happens is that to me is what the events are. It's not really about the debate. It's not what that Biden or Trump were present at all. It could have been John Doe and Jane Smith. It's not even what they did. It's people's ability to, as quick as they can, extract from that event some kind of meme, soundbite, conceptual, contorted assemblage, and then put it out into the memeplex, into the Coliseum, which is in ruins now. We've been saying that it's not stable anymore, and hoping that through an appearance of going viral, through the appearance of creating kind of a big tent consensus like a Blockbuster, they say, I have won, I have meaning, and the world has been restored. So we don't have events anymore. And that's why it feels, if you're an aware person at all, when you watch something like that, it feels sad, it feels hollow, it feels flat, because nothing is happening. It's everybody waiting for the next note or beat to drop so that they can grab a scrap of it and magnify it and say, okay, now that I'm getting all these likes, now that I'm getting all these people agreeing with me or even disagreeing with me, I'm getting attention on it. I have access to the event. I own the event now, and it's this. And what it is it's just an image. So the consequences of the images, because we're not there live, will be the images of the consequences.
And that's now mediating all linguistic kind of
pretty much.
Yeah, like because it's really fun. You mentioned a long time about how things will be local over the past 3 or 4 months, and over the next like 6 months or whatever, how things are going to become very local, and that has just become so clear here, because I finally found my tribe after my previous tribe basically kicked me out during the pandemic. Like that collapsed, and then I spent 3 or 4 years in the wilderness in a strange place, and then now I found it, and they're all in person. I all have these like freewheeling conversations with free thinkers in person, and it's just marvelous. And then online, it's like, whoa, what's going on here? Like,
well, it's like Lord of the Flies or Mad Max online.
Exactly. Yeah.
You just you say the most innocuous thing, and I mean it was always like that in a way. It's incentivized to create conflict, but now it's not even conflict. It's fight or flight, knee-jerk reaction, confusion. You get the sense, and I think I've written about this too. Maybe it's just my draft folder, but I feel like I wrote recently is that you almost, it actually makes it easier to have compassion for people now, because you get the sense more that they're fighting themselves rather than actually people. It's so funny. Like when I launched this account in January 2020 on X, people would bust my chops left and right. Well, what do you mean, like planetary influence, and getting me deep into the weeds of these free will versus fate. Like people were seriously like trying to figure this out, and it wasn't agreeable at all, but it was an intellectual debate. Now people, they cannot.
It's all values based.
Not.
Yeah.
They can't formulate thought. And then that's something I've been wondering. People say that there's reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, people can't, the cohesive thought is not there. And so, yeah, it's just funny. I think even the online right, I don't even know what it was about, but some of the large figureheads a couple of weeks ago, I know a lot of it is the fallout from Bronze Age pervert, and but there was something else going on, and it creates some kind of ruckus because you see all these big accounts kind of obliquely referring to some kind of drama, and then here we are like the next week and it's not even mentioned anymore. So I feel like even it's just like everybody is extremely reactive right now. There's not a lot of okay, well, we kind of like sorted out this factional issue, and
now we're back to normal. There's no back to normal ever.
No, there's not. Like, even they don't revert back to some kind of normal thing. I think that some of their followers get burned out and they get a new audience to refer to.
Yep.
So they don't even go back to normal either. And I think that's why you see a lot of these bigger gurus frustrated that there was a sense that you'd have a lot of the similar people replying to you all the time. The only thing that I saw that was, and even I stopped following it, is that early in the year there was some kind of Ray Pete, who is a kind of a cult, like has established an occult like following after his death, and after every saint passes, he becomes kind of like a patron saint.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. If he were alive, it would be
it would have been over. Matter. Yeah,
exactly. But his death, we look at critics like Roland Barthes, and wrote essays like The Death Author, post how the people take kind of sacrosanct, written in stone kind of word. What happened is that some kind of large forum based on him and his cult like following had a schism and kicked the guy out, or started a separate forum. But that's the kind of thing now. I'm sure you could go and check in with this splinter faction, and it's not like, okay, that was the fairy tale ending and now they're just thriving. I'm sure constant churn and destabilization even there too. So I think that was the big thing, is that in the 2010s you had these large countercultural movements online that were fairly stable.
Yep.
And people saw that, and by the time they jumped on that bandwagon, we were already getting into an unstable zeitgeist from about 2020. So there's all this kind of like, I don't know, e-girl, raw milk, female influencer offshooting from a lot of the right wing kind of, I'm tropical, I'm anabolic, I'm running on the beach and doing pull-ups on palm branches, kind of role playing. What's happened is that you would think if we were in a stable timeline that those new offshoots would grow and evolve in a similar way. But what's happened is that they haven't. And furthermore, you would think that if they're an offshoot and they're going to grow in a similar way, that they would have some kind of diplomatic understanding between the camps that they've grown out of, so to speak. Or if they haven't grown out of them, the ground was laid for them to flourish. It's like people will be like, is there some factory making these like raw milk girl accounts? Like, why are you here, right? It's very interesting that these communities are realizing that they are in flux constantly too. I think what happened is because there was a modicum of stability for these countercultural groups, it created a very militant sense. in them that, hey, we're going to, hey, Tucker Carlson made a kind of oblique remark referencing one of our anonymous posters, the sense like, hey, we're going to make an impact on the big tent culture. We can marshal our forces and create a meme that's going to be on Fox News, or that's going to show up in some kind of leftist magazine or whatever. And because they don't have that now, that sense of having a widespread impact, and there's all these latecomers too saying, oh, okay, all you have to do is like project a lifestyle online, and then you gain a kind of like neo-tribal following. They're all just looking at each other, like blinking their eyes in confusion, and like bumper cars that or that or this or that type of, and they get angry and then they just kind of dissipate again. It's extremely different. Where in the 2010s you may have various sects of the the pickup community and the finance community that were segmented and other. And so one of the things I go into in the Patchwork Manifesto is that the type of individual that will thrive now is a Pocahontas individual that can go between tribes and not be, in the sense of all of these tribes are kind of osmotic way feeding each other. I don't know if like Raw Milk E-Girl would exist if the kind of right-wing bodybuilder community hadn't made such a splash. But what's happening is that going between them is probably more satisfying and pleasurable, because what's happening is that they're not able to communicate to each other in ways because they're bobbing on the sea. They're not standing on stable ground. And so their communication with each other is, it's very fluid at best, and it's contentious and argumentative at worst.
And this kind of gets into the term that one of my in-person friends here told me about, which is rhizomatic. And rhizomatic.
Yeah, was that Sean?
What's that?
Sean, did he bring that term up?
No. Somebody here in person. He's not much on Twitter. He gives philosophy talks down here, and he talked about Deleuze, who's this, the French
Oh, I'm familiar with Deleuze.
Yeah. So can you talk about what rhizomatic is and how it relates to this, particularly the Pocahontas thing? Because that's my strategy, basically, is to like all the crazy things. And I've never been a certain person. Like I've never had a great degree of certainty, which is felt like a weakness when I was younger, because I was surrounded by people who were very, very certain about the nature of reality and where we're headed as a civilization.
Yeah.
And now it feels like it's like the world is my oyster in a bit, because I'm still grieving the loss of that former past. But
of course. Yeah. I mean, it's not easy. I often have said that one of the biggest of the big tent is me. I love the big tent. I love watching old movies that the whole culture watched when they came out, and so I often will dunk on people who are trad and say, let's return, or who are, extremely ideological on the right and on the left, and who will say this is the utopian future that we're going towards instead of the past that we're resurrecting.
Yeah.
But I mean, I share in that sense of grief, because it was a sense of protection and nourishment and security.
Yeah.
And it's as for all the creativity and new forms of pleasure that were being offered now, it's challenging too. So rhizomatic is definitely an idea that was formulated by Gilles Deleuze and his friend Felix Guattari, who was a psychoanalyst who worked in mental ward. Deleuze was more of kind of your traditional academic, went to prestigious university in Paris, and they were both keen observers of the 1968 riot in Paris, which there's a film that I may review for a newsletter here soon called The Dreamers, which is about that era.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's a great film. Pretty racy though, and a little yeah, pretty taboo in many senses. But a thought-provoking film. And what they did is they were seeing in this kind of they were future pacing Francis Fukuyama's 1991 essay, The End of History, which is about the collapse of the Soviet Union and why the 90s were so exuberant, because it felt like the future was almost here, but it hadn't yet formed. It was a pre-9/11 exuberance and optimism. They were future pacing that because they were seeing the subtitle of the book, the two books that they wrote together, Part 1, Anti-Oedipus, and Part 2, Thousand Plateaus. The subheader of that is Capitalism. And seeing in the schizophrenic nature of our mob-like, cult-like society, the inner workings of capitalism, which a rhizome, if you've ever done any yard work or if you've ever laid sod, it all kind of connects together in this crazy tangled mass, like something you might see hanging from like a New Jersey street post. You know, all the people's utilities are mangled together, and looks like something that's an extreme electrical hazard.
Yeah.
And they oppose that to tree-like thinking, which is root to canopy. And so Rhizomatic, I think their whole aspect, which I take influence from, was unpredictability. Because if a rhizome grows in ways that knots back on itself, but then like shoots out in some kind of unexpected, crazy direction, whereas a tree is always A to B, they saw in capitalism, you would think that as kind of leftist French philosophers, that Marxism was the way that revolution would occur. But to them, it was the schizophrenic nature of capitalism that influenced things like the 1968 Paris riot.
Yeah, interesting.
And so they said by nature it's rhizomatic, by nature it's revolutionary, because it pushes people to organize their reality in ways that is nonlinear and unpredictable. I mean, we take it for granted now, but think of the types of faces one must wear in a world they were seeing happen then, and it's certainly now, where your private life blends with public life all the time. It's not this tree-like structure where there's you at home, and here's the canopy, here's you on the world stage or on LinkedIn or at your job. All of these things are kind of colliding rhizomatically, and so it affects one's psychology, and it makes us basically, in a latent way, schizophrenic. They're not saying literally schizophrenic, but schizophrenic in a way that, well, what is schizophrenic? The root of the word is schiz, right? It's creating it's a line that deviates. It's subversive, and so if people have a revolutionary schizophrenic consciousness as a result of capitalism, they say it's an axiomatic system just by nature of being itself. It means that people are they are not it's hopeful in a sense, because they're very against these kind of labels that we've adopted for ourselves. Oh, I'm ADHD, I'm bipolar, I'm BPD, I'm this, I identify as that, right? These kind of tree-like boxes that have a stable menu of behaviors and codes that can then be diagnosed, and then like an industrial system, here's your medication, here's your mantras, here's your affirmations. This is something I like joked about
Oh, interesting
for
affirmations.
the
I
bling
hadn't
ring.
thought of that.
Right. All of positive neo-spirituality is an extension of kind of like the industrialized
Cool.
psychology, because the mom and the bling ring, which is based on a true story, is all about like affirmations and mantras. But it's because, and that's why the girl in the movie goes and robs all these Beverly Hills celebrities, because she's trying to break out of this hard mold of personality that says like, hey, you're a vessel, it's all inputs, and then we're going to get an output.
God, so crazy. And it feels like a very, very drastic shift that we're headed to, in particular relation to technology. And this question has been kind of at the back of my mind the entire time. Is like, what's your take on AI? Because it feels like you're a bit of an outsider in terms of AI, an outsider with a very interesting perspective that I want to understand. And I've been in it for the past couple years, basically, and this technology is very, very powerful. But it's unclear to anybody involved how it's going to contribute to this patchwork age. Like it feels like it's totally not concluded yet, which is part of the whole thing, I guess, which is that there is no certainty about this thing. Although people are trying to turn it into a god, they're trying to turn it into a demon. And those things both seem just totally absurd. Like that's just going to lead to some really great memes, but also a lot of absurdity. What's your take on AI and where we're headed with that?
So it's absolutely going to continue to be referred to in a god demon sense. And I think that to take this in a woo-woo direction, we are going to see through things like that, and of paranormal realities. It will, through understanding our electromagnetic reality and how, it's funny. It's a lot of things that I think that we notice, but just kind of, we'll kind of like get on with our day and not really consider. But I think all of us have had cars or phones or lamps or things that we feel kind of, they respond to us in certain ways. They almost have like moods and things like that. It's not just, a box with a current running through it. I think as we delve more into that, we're going to understand ourselves more, and the various realities that make up our sensory experience. And it's going to get extremely complicated. I think one of the avenues through which we're going to get to that is through relationships. I think a lot of people are going to develop relationships with AI girlfriends and boyfriends and spouses, and it's going to extend. They'll create whole narrative dramas and TV shows and arcs, and maybe you can leave that open. You think, okay, like what if I create a cast of characters that
you can have a relationship with
AI,
them?
Yeah, and I have an AI girlfriend, but like, what if I leave to AI like the fact that, I don't know, maybe a vengeful boyfriend comes in, and people will of course create all kinds of stakes around it. They'll probably tie crypto to it, because if it's just a game, what matter is it if there's a vengeful boyfriend who enters the narrative through some kind of AI deus ex machina. But let's say, some kind of social credit within a community you inhabit, or you've got some kind of crypto staked on how well you manage these relationships. Wow. You gamify it. People will come to understand, oh, what is it that actually, I think it'll come down to the idea of consciousness and vessels, because it's all about embodiment. The fact that a lot of the Luddites don't like about AI is it seems like it's disembodied, and that's where a lot of the demon terminology comes from. But in the spiritual community, it's the New Age community. The mantra for ages has been, you're a spiritual being having a physical experience. And so they're not too far from the same thinking as some of the um, people who would call, even people who appreciate AI, oh well, it's just something running inside a computer. I think that these philosophical models are going to
Hmm.
encourage us to say, like, well, is this consciousness really just
Embodied. Is it,
yeah, like
am I just the
it's just
body? Am I
like,
just the mind? Like, are
right?
those
Is it
things?
just
Yep.
a radio wave that I pick up on through my um, pineal gland transceiver, right? And then
Yeah.
I'm able to like move my mouth and talk to you on Zoom, or is it something else? And that's, there's so much theology that's going to come into play with that, predestination and fate
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all that. It really complicated. I think most people won't be able to handle it, and so um, Dostoevsky thought that at the end of history, basically the world will have to become a church or a hospital again. And
Oh.
yeah, that was basically the conclusion that he reached at in the Brothers Karamazov, um, and because he thought that there was just too much sickness to
Hmm.
be able to
Hmm.
just rehabilitate with some kind of, maybe like, or in this sense, like, you're going to have masses of amounts of people managing this who won't be able to wrap their heads around this. And so maybe they get their, so there'll be ethical questions, right? I'll give you an ethical AI camp where you can go and have your AI girlfriend or whatever, and yeah,
Yeah.
you'll have all these synthetic relationships, but if
It's
you're
all be a
somebody who's
simulacra,
Christian or whatever, right? It'll be good for you.
but it'll all be a simulacra too, as well. So it'll lack the
Correct.
essence that I believe is that sort of embodiment, but not embodiment in a body. It's like essence of soul inside of a body, but like that's the simulacra that's created inside the machine feels like it can't touch that. And so a lot of people will have these very synthetic experiences which
They will.
don't
And they'll
heal.
just inhabit a completely different parallel reality from a lot of other people who disavow that. And that's something that I talk directly in the Patchwork Age is that even if it's just one person on the globe who adopts this kind of immersive
Yeah.
AI synthetic relationship lifestyle, that sets the course for the fact that we are diverging in
Yeah.
consciousness.
Yep.
It's not that that person, I don't know, we can get into the weeds of that. If that person is weak or bad or stupid, it's just the fact that they're, or sheep or whatever, it's again, and that's where I think AI is headed, is that appeals to whatever is emerging in them. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who just use it because it's a form of subsistence. They don't want to put in the work to develop talents or
Interesting.
skills or whatever. And so it's a kind of soma for them. It's a kind of lotus flower for them. But there will be other people who just kind of decide, well, this is where, this is a zone where my neural pathways feel the most stimulated. And
Yeah.
so
Which it
they'll,
already happens with video games. Like that's already.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, it's already very present in the gamer community. So it's not like they put their brain in a jar. There are other people who are real, who will be doing the same thing as they. But you're right that they'll live a largely synthetic lifestyle. I think it's already here. I mean, you just don't see, it's 2024, and I don't personally see, there's a lot of people who just stay home now. They
Yep.
don't they don't do anything. Sometimes I'll take the day off on a Friday and I'll go out at 11 o'clock on a Friday, and it's slammed with traffic.
Mm.
What are all these people doing? They're not working.
Yeah.
They're not all retired.
Yeah.
So I think the field is primed for people who are going to have AI synthetic relationships and are going to integrate a degree of spontaneity into it, not just, hey, because people will get bored if it's too predictive.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I can always just go to my AI girlfriend and have a shoulder to cry on. If it starts to become like, oh, well, now she's got this AI boss that she's getting pulled away from, and I have to like find a way to help her solve this AI work problem or AI work conflict or whatever. Yeah.
This is that's been an interesting kind of foray into what could happen for some large part of the population. What we've
Yeah.
been speaking about for the past, and we got to probably do another 15 minutes or so. What we've been speaking about is this sort of schizophrenic reality for those of us who are kind of able to work in this creative world. And it feels like that's nothing new. Like if you read about Da Vinci, or
Sure.
you read about other creative
Absolutely.
figures, like this is not something new. It's just,
Not at all.
yeah, now the whole
I'm
thing
very
is,
I'm very insistent about that too. The One of the early threads that I put out about the Patchwork Age was kind of a series of figureheads. Patchwork isn't, because that would be hypocritical, right? To say that Patchwork Age is a happening,
mm,
like as if it's the big tent thing that replaces the big tent. It's really just a conscious awareness that a certain phase of history has ended, and now we're looking back to all these touchstones, as you point out, not to resurrect them and say like, okay, now I'm the Da Vinci cult. Okay, now I'm the trad homesteader cult. It's like, okay, it's been done in the past. How can I use the threads of their thought in order to kind of formulate something outside the bounds that everyone else is doing, which is how can I be as blockbuster as possible? How can I be as Big Ten as possible? Because you're seeing the diminishing returns on that every time someone tries to deploy that strategy. And so, yeah, you look back to Da Vinci, you look back to Thomas Merton, you look back to Ken Kesey or whoever, and then you say like, okay, what do I have around me in my environment that, like those figures, I can
mm,
create bridges and combine in all ways in order to feel like I'm thriving, that I feel pleasure, that I feel
mm,
creativity, and not that the first thing I want to do is run to a synthetic AI relationship, as soon as that's offered to me, because I'm already co-creating. That's kind of another kind of heavy word, but I'm already co-creating with my reality.
mm,
And it's possible. I mean, I feel like I've been able to. The thing is, though, when I say that I feel like I've been able to do it, it's not like a brand. It's not
mm.
like, okay, I'm like a drop shipper now, or what
Yeah,
in
you
terms of
can't put
like
it into
that
a
being my
box.
thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's what I aim to do when I walk outside my door every day. Now it may not happen that day. It may not happen for a
Yeah.
long streak of days, but then it may happen in across 72 hours or a couple of hours. And I can readily identify, okay, this is vital, this is creative, this has a lot of agency. And as long as I'm kind of, here's again another kind of neo spiritual word, as long as I'm kind of affirming these things and acting on them decisively, reality will continue to
Mm,
bring me resources that I can ping off of. A lot of this is social. It's kind of hard to describe in a kind of anecdotal way. So I try to use movies a lot in my newsletters to model social situations
yeah.
where someone may say something off the cuff, or they may make a decision that's outside of the box, and it completely alters the of the social circle that they're in. And I try to do that a lot myself. That's how I've begun to apply the patchwork age philosophy that I've thought about intellectually into my physical reality. And people respond to it very strongly because very few other people do that. They don't expect me to say certain things. They don't expect me to behave in certain ways. Um, they don't expect me to suggest certain things for them, whether that's advice or just in the moment. And it makes an impact on people. A lot of times, if I fall out of a circle with someone, and this happened recently, I saw someone that I probably hadn't seen in a couple of years this past week. And he goes, oh, yeah, I remember you.
Mm,
Because you can make a very lasting impression on someone if you are
If you
uh
don't play this game that everybody else is
you don't
playing.
play this game. Yeah, I think it's easier for me to kind of talk about in a kind of like negative or oppositional sense.
Uh,
And I hit on this in my latest newsletter, like to say what I don't do. A lot of times the posts that you see on social media are anecdotes of things that happened with someone's night out or at a like a company barbecue or something. And they'll be like, yeah, I kind of like let this like anti-Biden, anti-woke comment slip at the barbecue and got like a knowing silent nod from Bill in the finance department, right? And it's like, you can live that way now, but it's like the clandestine revolutionary meme that was prominent in the 2010s. I just don't think you,
there are no playbooks
do
anymore.
it. Yeah, well, it just doesn't do anything. I think delusion, illusion, cultishness,
Yeah.
fantasy,
Yeah.
escapism, these are really big in the zeitgeist right now. And it's very possible for you to delude yourself into thinking that you actually have an identity and a kind of secret handshake in that. But really you're not doing anything at all. And so I think a lot of people, the anxiety that this was one of the posts that got a lot of traction earlier in the year on Twitter, is that a lot of people are feeling anxieties because they could have been building this whole time. And best time to start, if you haven't, is now.
Oh, yeah.
But instead, they're continuing to double down on these
Yeah.
strategies, like pretending it's still, 2014, and posting these things also for likes, like, hey, I made this kind of like slightly spicy anti-woke comment at a company barbecue, and this is an example of how I inhabit a certain identity and certain culture. You just look at it and people aren't even excited about it anymore. You feel like the poster isn't even excited about it because it's not generative at all. It's dead on arrival. And so yeah, I really do believe like the Patchwork Age is something that you can apply in your life. It's just um it's really not a model though. It's a manifesto. It's a way to co-create with your reality based on what you like. For me, I like movies, I like music, I like paintings, and that's a way for me to create touchstones that give me new ways of thinking about what I'm going to bring up in conversation, what I'm going to make in terms of the art that I do on my free time. Other people may be more interested in exercise and fitness and sports. Others may be more interested in nutrition and chemistry and studies. But whatever those touchstones are, you don't have to model them in a way like, I don't know, let's go the other direction from secret handshake cult to kind of Andrew Huberman hubris, right? You don't have to model it in a way where like you just discovered the secret theory of everything either. In this most extremely public way versus this clandestine private way. You don't have to do that either. I still think, I have a strong following of people for the newsletters that love them, but I still think at a general zeitgeist level, um, what we're going to see this fall is people just like slowly loosening their death grip on the fact that they want one or the other or both. They want this sense that they're secret handshake, special person, special snowflake, but they also want this like Huberman sense of like
I'm the
being
guy.
very loudmouth and seen as, you know, correct beyond a shadow of a doubt. They want one or the other or some mixture of both. And really what they have is a better option, a better third option, which is more individualistic or micro-tribal. And it's, hey, I can say that I like something and I get inspiration from it and I use it in a way that doesn't necessarily port into some codified menu of lifestyle behaviors
Ooh.
that is immediately like validated because there's a pool of people that says, hey, I do that too. Hey, I like sunbathe nude. Hey, I eat like, such and such fruit raw or whatever, because you put that out there and there's maybe like, it's a discoverability issue, right? There's maybe like one or two other three people online that may see that and are like, Oh, hey, that's also a consciousness thing too. You talk about like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche writing about the same thing in the same time, same region of Europe, but didn't know about each other. How does that happen? Talk about like kind of picking up on wavelengths. It's the same thing that, we talk about AI and discoverability issues now in the patchwork age on social media. You find like someone in Iowa is like into that too. You're so glad, but you don't get 18,000, 20,000 people going, oh yeah, like we all do that too, or we want to do that too. And so it's scary for people. It doesn't give them that satisfaction of having like a secret insider cult or this kind of like Huberman neo big tent. They put it out there, and it's kind of antithetical to the way social media has been. They don't get a lot of likes, and they're like, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to go into this version of my reality where I pick together pieces from stuff that I picked up from the health food community and the artistic community and put that out there in terms of post or branding or company products or some kind of like Discord group, because we're still in the back. We're still kind of working through a backlog of the cultural zeitgeist that says, well, you've just got to have something that resonates with people immediately and in a big splashy way, or kind of like a niche, kind of clandestine secret handshake kind of way, and lacking either of those. The I think we'll see like X and Instagram and Facebook become like AT&T. They'll just almost be like public utilities in a way, because we're looking more towards like Discord and Telegram and maybe even like Twitch channels, these like micro tribal ways, in order for people to feel like happy doing that and not like, oh, I put this on like X and 2 people liked it, therefore it's not good, therefore no patchwork age philosophy for me. I'll just go back to like posting about how you shouldn't wear polyester, and look, I got 50 likes in one afternoon, I'm doing the right thing.
It makes me think that reminds me of Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza,
Yep.
who basically he
Deleuze likes Spinoza a lot. He was
oh,
strongly influenced by Spinoza. Yeah, he wrote an entire book about him.
so and Spinoza basically offered this third way. Where
Yep.
everybody else was talking about monism versus dualism and determinism versus free will, and he offered just this third
Right.
alternative that was just like, okay, well, you got those two guys, and everybody else believes those two things. But what happens if there's a secret third thing? And then
Yep.
it feels like that for like it feels like that's where we're headed, where it's just like the
It
big tent.
absolutely is.
Yeah, and it feels
Yeah.
good to go towards that because although it's less fun, it's less dopamine, there's less rush because you can't get that hit of being the right one, getting the right one, and having the other person be opposed to that. You're just like in
Right.
a strange world where it's like, okay, well, that could be an option. Yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah. Deleuze has this great quote that is, children are natural Spinozas.
Hmm.
They don't even, because again, we're talking about in the context of his discussion of schizophrenia and how schizos can find third way very easily because
Oh.
how they're wired. And so, it talks a lot of like Western psychoanalytical theory, like Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, is often featured on the domestic scene. And that's why the first book by Deleuze and Guattari is called Anti-Oedipus, because it's a lot about childhood development. And he says, children are natural Spinozas because they automatically see third ways.
Oh.
And it's interesting. There's another astrologer out there who to tie into this, his idea is that uh, the world has no more steroids. And so you talk about the exuberance of the 90s and Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History, Fall of the Soviet Union, the triumph of capitalism and democracy and the free world and all of that. If you look at that and you look at all the entertainment and the products that were
Yeah.
being created and distributed at that time, it felt like takeoff, right? It just and just the web, the internet, and all of that, early social media. His idea is that there's no more steroids, which is, I often find that we have similar ideas, although we phrase it in different ways. it's similar to that now is that the resourcefulness comes, I believe resourcefulness comes from not placing your chips on some moonshot, some lottery bet that, everybody and their grandmother is suddenly going to adopt the raw milk trad lifestyle, and you were the early adopter. So you're getting ready to cash in whatever amount of time. That kind of like steroid boost. See, that's kind of what people are looking at the 90s like, oh man, if I could have like predicted the explosion of the web back then, I could have got in early. They're trying to do that now with like and again, a lot of these things I do myself. I've drank raw milk for years. I've tried to eliminate polyester for years. There these various sects and camps, they're hoping to ride some rocket ship of steroids into some kind of like
utopia.
Utopia, and often some kind of halcyon moment, because a lot of the things that they're saying are good are based on quote unquote the old ways. And so I think third ways, while they don't have that dopamine hit, they're also kind of acknowledging the new reality that, well, there are no big dopamine hits to be had, and you don't want it anyways, because
it's also simulacra.
Exactly. Oh yeah. Well, it's also the sense, I think, because everything has become so individualized in the patchwork age, as we've been describing here, a lot of people feel like they have they have the strength and the wherewithal to manage something that was outsourced to the collective mind in the 90s. Like, it wasn't just like, I don't know, 50,000 anti-polyester raw milk people online that was managing the zeitgeist in the 90s. It was millions and billions of people. And so, this kind of Herculean task of like, okay, like we can talk about, there was a small number of people who facilitated innovation like Tim Berners-Lee and all that with the World Wide Web. But in terms of adoption, it was millions of people who were watching the final. Like, you can do the heavy lifting for the populace. It's just like to cycle or something like that. They're only going to really do it if they want to. You're not going to be able to convince people of it. Eventually it kind of like catches on in kind of a mass sense or whatever. But this kind of hope of and steroids, I guess, is we're kind of using this kind of metaphor here, that you can just get in early before it injects into the culture. Imagine having that mentality and then feeling like you have the responsibility to manage how that unfurls. I mean, not to say that Seinfeld phenomenon was organic in the 90s, but it was managed by these vast networks and these syndicates and these commercial placements and so on. Companies that had multiple departments and ways to kind of manage that cultural phenomenon. You think, okay, yes, things will become more grassroots in the future, but imagine, okay, let's just say hypothetically, there's no more pasteurized milk in the world. It's all like raw milk. And again, I'm a proponent of it. I'm not, I don't think it's bad for you, but one of the big things about like the Seinfeld zeitgeist and the pasteurized milk zeitgeist and the big tent institutionalization, when you have these broadcast companies and these syndicates, it's based on safety. Right? Because it's synchronized and coordinated. So yes, it's sterilized, but it's on demand and it's codified so that it works. Whether you're in Paris watching the last Seinfeld episode or you're at New York Times Square watching the last Seinfeld episode, you're going to have a similar experience, right? You're all inoculated, and yes, I'm using that term specifically. You're all inoculated against any risk.
Yeah.
oh, hey, I watched the Seinfeld episode and I thought this was too woke, and now I'm going to go complain about it on X, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have that. You had maybe some beginnings of it, but you didn't have that. Now it's like, oh my gosh, like I drank Coke and gave me the runs or whatever, right? You know, that's the thing, is that all these things that people are very interested in, the reason that they have a glow about them is, to their credit, they are anti-Big Ten. They're not conditioned, they're not sterilized, they're not hyper-industrialized.
Interesting.
The problem is that for that reason, like milk, we say milk is homogenized, right? They're non-homogenized. And
Yeah.
so to port them into the rest of society, and you can imagine that you can manage that socially, you're going to get people saying, well, you said it worked for you and it cleared up your eczema, but it gave me hives, right? I wouldn't want to be in that said, hey, I'm going to stake my claim on this cult and rise to the top when the steroids are injected, because you're, again, the nonlinear schizophrenic nature of the patchwork age means that people are going to have divergent responses. So again, that's the good thing. We're moving out of the big tent where everything's, you know, homogenized and commercialized and mass produced. But to think then, okay, haha, you know, like rubbing my hands, now I'm the king,
Yeah.
right? Like I
That's
don't know
over.
if you really want that to
Yeah.
be the mission statement of your identity and your community, because you're really leaving yourself open, or especially in a fractionated world, all sorts of fragment attacks from people who are having diverse experiences from the magic pill cure that you are evangelizing about.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's almost like the cult itself is no longer going to become verified method because of the karmic retribution from giving people prescriptions and such. And prescriptions are,
So
yeah.
exactly, that's one of the big things I read about in the manifesto is we're going to have to figure out a way to create verified third-party tribunals. You saw some of this with like Ethereum and stuff like that, but because who's going to be the third party that verifies the third party, right? That's a problem. It's like, okay, so you come in here and you create these kind of bodies that don't have vested interests and can kind of like a Pocahontas mediate, okay, this person sold me this like magic cure and it didn't work for me, or whatever. I'm not trying to hold them on the hook, but I just like want to like critique them publicly, and it's creating all this drama. You know, having some kind of like um at least temporarily agreed upon third party that can come in and say, to kind of like create some kind of cohesion and temporary order to the conversation. You see this in certain individuals on this side of Twitter who say, yes, but I think Keith Walkowitz is one of the better figures of this, where he talks about, he's like, hey, I use sunscreen, but I love being out in the sun. You know, and he goes, kind of being rent asunder by their own prescriptions. It's not to say like I'm sitting here like just waiting for all the Schadenfreude to befall all these cults. Like I hope some of these people come out with some novel ideas, but I think they're so bloody tunneled that they'll probably need these third parties to come in here when these other tribes come in and say like, hey, that's another thing that Keith goes on about. He'll wear like polyester swim trunks. No, hey, I came in and I wore polyester swim trunks and it didn't do anything for me, or it made me infertile or whatever. Like I'm just going to continually attack you whenever you post online. You know, I think we're trying to, there is dissensus now instead of consensus, but I think we're also trying to move past cancel culture because we're all cancelable now. And
Yeah.
so there has to be room for disagreement, but it can't be like cancel culture. And I think the way that you create dissensus is probably the true believers are too, you know, up in their own stuff to be able to detach objectively. So there will have to be these kind of neutral, skeptical, even know, that come in and kind of mediate discussion. Maybe that's things that you do with your podcast, that come in and provide spaces in a way for the ideas to breathe, so that someone says, okay, like the cultists are a little unhinged, but they have a point. Like raw milk is not only delicious, but it has, a lot of enzymes in it that make it easier to digest. So even if you're quote unquote lactose intolerant, you may be able to benefit from it.
Mm.
On the other hand, this idea that we're just going to replace every corner store with raw milk in America as a vision is just it's utopian branding at best.
Interesting. Well, awesome. This has been so much fun. How can people find out more about you and your newsletter?
Sure, I would love people to read the newsletter. That's where I put a lot of my thoughts and work into. It's every 2 weeks. They can find it at zeitvillemedia.substack.com. That's ZEITVILLE. That was based on a kind of serial novel that I had produced about a fictional town, 2021 to 2022, named Zeitville. And it's basically was a fictional world where the Patchwork Age was in effect, and I used it to kind of demonstrate to people a different mode of reality. And so that's where the idea of Zeitville comes from. Zeit, of course, is from zeitgeist. Zeit means time, so it's Timeville. So, it's a place where multiple timelines occur, and people are, they're free to inhabit a cult-like timeline or not. I did go into cults in that fictional serial story. So yeah, Zeitville is the idea. It's kind of a dramatization of the reality that we live in now, which is multiple timelines in a state of fragmentation and dissensus.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stuart. This is awesome.